The wind came low and hard across the plains, dragging the smell of dry earth and old grass toward the Boone ranch. Elias Boone stood at the fence line with his hat brim pulled low, eyes narrowed against the grit. For 3 days he had barely slept, mind running in circles around the same thought. Today she would arrive. A letter and a promise, nothing more, had tethered his heart to this moment. His boots scuffed the dust as he paced, restless as a caged stallion. The land stretched wide and empty in every direction, horizon painted with scrub and stone. It was a lonely country, the kind that carved silence deep into a man's bones. Elias had lived in that silence for years, his only companions a groan of the windmill, the bawl of cattle, and the echo of his own memories. He remembered too vividly the night his family was taken from him, the raid that had burned down his first cabin and left him with nothing but scars and a hollow that refused to close. He had sworn then never to love again, never to need another soul. Yet the nights grew longer, the weight of solitude heavier, until pride bent beneath the burden. He'd sent away for a bride like a desperate gambler throwing his last coin on the table. The thought of a woman, someone to soften the hard edges of his days, had stirred something half-dead inside him. He had pictured her countless times, small, delicate, a gentle presence to fill the empty rooms and maybe, in time, the emptiest spaces in his chest. Now the town depot loomed ahead as he rode in, his horse lathered and restless beneath him. Smoke rose from the blacksmith's shop. Children darted across the street, and a group of ranch hands lounged outside the saloon, their laughter cutting through the dry air. Their eyes followed Elias, whispers chasing him like bears on a coat. The loner of Deadwood Plains, they called him. Too long without company, too long without laughter. A man who stared too hard at the horizon, as if daring it to bring back what it had stolen. He ignored them, tying his horse to the post and stepping up onto the wooden platform of the station. The noon sun pressed heavy, heat wavering off the dirt road where wagon ruts cut deep grooves. His palms felt damp inside his gloves. He tugged them off and rubbed the sweat on his trousers, jaw tight. The air was thick with waiting. Each creak of the depot sign, each murmur from the townsfolk, seemed to draw the moment closer. Elias's pulse kept a hard, steady rhythm. He stood stiff as a board, boots planted, as though the earth itself might shift if he let go. Then came the sound, wheels groaning over the packed dirt, hooves striking in uneven rhythm. The wagon appeared at the far bend of the street, swaying under the weight of trunks piled high. Children shouted, dogs barked, and the small crowd leaned forward as though the whole town had been holding its breath for this single arrival. Elias's throat went dry. He pulled his hat lower, as if the brim could shield him from expectation. The wagon rolled to a halt, with protesting, dust curling up in a lazy cloud. The driver climbed down, stretched his back, and swung open the door. The moment stretched, tight as a pulled rope. Elias's chest felt bound, caught between fear and hunger for what might step out. At first there was only a dark silhouette framed by the wagon's shadow. Then, with a deliberate step, she emerged. She was nothing like the picture Elias had painted in his mind. Broad shoulders caught the sun, a figure towering head and chest above the murmuring crowd. Her skirt swished against strong legs, and her boots landed on the planks with a weight that made them groan. Sunlight flashed across her hair, bound in a simple braid, and when she lifted her chin her gaze met his square on, unwavering. The whispers rippled louder. Children snickered. Someone muttered, "Lord, she could wrestle a bull." Elias's mouth went dry. His first instinct was disbelief, followed swiftly by a flare of embarrassment that heated his ears beneath the brim of his hat. This was not the delicate companion he had imagined, not the gentle whisk to tame the silence of his nights. She was a storm wrapped in a woman's frame, a presence so large it swallowed the platform whole. And yet he could not look away. She adjusted her shawl, her expression unreadable, and stepped down from a wagon with calm precision. The boards creaked again under her weight. The driver tipped his hat and muttered something about the long road from Missouri, but Elias barely heard him. His pulse was a hammer. The woman's eyes held his, steady as stone. For a heart beat the town, the dust, the whispers all seemed to fade. In that silence Elias felt a strange twist in his chest, a sensation sharp and unexpected. This was not the woman he had ordered. This was the woman fate had sent. And standing there, with the whole town waiting to laugh or to cheer, Elias Boone could only wonder whether the West had just delivered him salvation, or ruin. Elias had braced himself for many possibilities on the long ride into town, but none of them resembled the woman now standing before him. Her presence filled the depot platform the way thunder fills a sky, impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss. She extended her hand without hesitation, palm rough, grip steady, her voice carrying the unshaken confidence of someone used to commanding her own ground. "Name's Clara May," she said, her tone clipped, no trace of apology. "You must be Boone." The sound of his surname spoken in an unflinching drawl struck him like a spur against the ribs. He nodded, muttered his own name as if it needed confirming, and took her hand. Her grip tightened just enough to make his bones creak. The smirks of the bystanders gnawed at his pride, but he kept his face hard, unreadable. They moved through the crowd together, Elias carrying her trunk though it weighed like a coffin. The people parted around them, whispering as though a parade of oddities had rolled into town. Clara May walked ahead with her shoulders squared, unconcerned by their stays, each step a declaration that she had long ago grown used to being noticed. Elias followed, wrestling with the unease twisting in his stomach. He had asked for companionship, not spectacle, yet here he was tethered to both. On the ride back to the ranch, silence pressed between them. The wagon jostled over ruts, the leather reins creaked in his hands. He stole glances at her, at the way her braid coiled down her back, at the calm steadiness in her eyes as she scanned the horizon. Not once did she fidget or attempt small talk. She seemed entirely at ease in the raw stillness that had always suffocated him. "You live far from neighbors?" she asked finally, voice low. "Too far for most," he answered. "Good," she said simply, and turned her gaze back to the rolling expanse. The single word struck him harder than any long speech. It wasn't comfort she sought. It was space, a chance to be left alone with her own thoughts. In that, perhaps, they shared more than he wanted to admit. By the time they reached the ranch, dusk had bruised the sky purple. Elias dismounted and reached for her trunk again, but Clara had already swung it over her shoulder as if it were nothing but a sack of grain. He swallowed his protest and let her carry it inside. Her boots echoed on the wooden floorboards, her presence filling the cabin with a sudden, startling vitality. For years the place had grown with emptiness. Now it seemed too small to contain her. She studied the single-room dwelling with sharp eyes, noting the sparse furnishings, the patched roof, the soot-stained stove. "You keep it clean," she said at last. "I manage." "Good. A filthy house makes a filthy man." She set the trunk down by the bed and sat on it, looking at him as though testing his steel. "We'll see if you manage half as well with company." The word stung, though her expression softened with the faintest curve of humor at the corner of her mouth. Elias felt his jaw tighten. He wasn't used to being measured, much less by someone who carried herself with such unshakable authority. He had pictured a woman grateful for shelter, delicate enough to be protected. Instead, he had found someone who looked him square in the eye and asked for no protection at all. Over the next hours, they shared a meal of beans and bread, conversation broken by long silences. Clara spoke little of herself, though in the few words she offered a sketch of her life took shape, an upbringing on a failing farm, endless seasons of chopping wood and wrestling livestock, survival as the only teacher. She had learned to do the work of two men because there had been no men to do it. She had come west not for romance, but because the letter Elias had written promised stability, and stability was a rare treasure. He listened, nodding, and wondered what she made of his own scars, the shadows in his eyes that hinted at a past he seldom named. Yet every time their gazes met, he felt as though she saw more than he wished to reveal. Later, when darkness pressed against the windows and the coyotes' yips carried across the fields, Elias stirred from his chair at the sound of their circling coals. He reached for his rifle by instinct, but Clara was already standing at the door, steady and unafraid. Without hesitation, she pulled the weapon from the wall, cocked it with a single motion, and stepped out onto the porch. The moon cast her in pale silver as she leveled the barrel into the night. A single shot cracked through the stillness, then another, and the coyotes scattered, their cries dissolving into the distance. Clara lowered the rifle as calmly as if she had swatted a fly, then leaned it against the doorframe and returned inside. Elias stared at her, caught between indignation and astonishment. His rifle had always been his companion, his shield against the endless vulnerability of the frontier. Now it had been wielded with ease by the woman who had stepped into his life uninvited yet undeniably present. "You shoot like you've been at it your whole life," he said finally, Clara shrugged. Out where I come from, you don't last long if you don't. There was no boast in her tone, only fact. She sat back on the trunk and unlaced her boots as though nothing unusual had transpired. Elias sank into silence, yet something within him shifted. The coyotes had fled, but the unease gnawing at him lingered, an unease born not of fear but of recognition. For years he had survived by sheer stubbornness, convinced his solitude made him strong. Yet here was a woman whose strength was undeniable, whose presence unsettled his carefully built walls. He felt exposed, tested, and strangely alive, as though the very foundation of his loneliness had begun to crack. The cabin grew quiet but for the sigh of the wind through the eaves. Elias lay awake long after Clara's breathing had deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep. Staring at the rafters above, he wondered if fate had played some cruel trick, or if, by some harsh miracle, it had given him exactly what he needed in the form he least expected. When at last his eyes closed, one thought remained sharp as a spur in his mind. Clara might not be the wife he had imagined, but she was already proving herself to be the partner he could not ignore. The days that followed unfolded like a test set by the land itself. Morning broke with a restless bull of cattle, and Elias rose to the grind of ranch work that had long defined his existence. Yet nothing felt familiar anymore, not with Clara moving across the yard with that purposeful stride, lifting rails, hauling buckets, and swinging an axe as if she had been born with one in her hand. He had once believed the ranch was too large for one man. Now he wondered if it was barely large enough to contain her strength. Her presence unsettled him. Pride pushed him to match her pace, to prove himself still the master of his own domain. But each time he strained against the weight of a fence post or wrestled a stubborn calf, she managed the task with disarming ease. When his grip slipped, hers held firm. When sweat blurred his vision, she kept her gaze steady. Each small victory of hers pressed against his ribs like a reminder of his shortcomings. The tension between them simmered in silence until it broke one afternoon by the corral. Elias cursed it as a calf tore free from the rope, dust clouding around its kicking legs. Clara caught the rope mid-snap, dug in her heels, and dragged the boiling creature to the ground with a grunt. She tied it down with a practiced twist, then glanced at him with a half-smile that carried both humor and challenge. "You've got soft hands for a cowboy," she said, wiping dust across her cheek. The remark stung sharper than any lash. Elias opened his mouth to retort, but found no words strong enough to pierce her calm amusement. Instead, he turned away, anger boiling as much at himself as at her. He had spent years proving his toughness to a land that devoured weaker men, and here she was, unraveling that proof without lifting more than an eyebrow. That night the silence between them thickened. The fire cracked in the stove, throwing shadows that danced across the cabin walls. Elias sat rigid in his chair while Clara worked a length of rope in her lap, fingers knotting and unknotting with practiced rhythm. At last she broke the quiet. "You wanted porcelain, didn't you?" she asked, not looking up. His jaw tightened. "I wanted a wife." "What you wanted," she said softly, "was someone fragile enough to make you feel unbreakable." The truth of it lodged in his chest, heavy and immovable. He had no answer, only the faint hiss of the fire filling the void. The land, merciless as always, offered no reprieve. One moonless night the ranch was split open by the thunder of hooves and the sudden crack of gunfire. Elias bolted from his chair, rifle in hand, heart hammering as shadows swept across the yard. Rustlers. Their shouts cut through the dark, fierce and reckless, horses weaving between the cattle as they drove the herd into chaos. Elias fired into the night, each shot sharp and breathless. The cattle bawled, dust choked the air, and the clang of hooves rattled the earth beneath him. He felt the old instinct roar wake, the cold, focused clarity of survival. Yet even as he steadied his aim, Clara was already there beside him, rifle braced against his shoulder, eyes narrowed against the smoke. The fight unfurled in bursts of light and sound, short, sharp sentences of violence. Gunfire, shouts, the shriek of a horse rearing in terror. One rustler lunged from the shadows, pistol raised, but Clara's shot struck true, knocking him from the saddle before Elias could blink. Another came charging, and she swung the butt of her rifle like a club, sending the man sprawling into the date. Elias fired until the last of the intruders fled, their retreat swallowed by the vast, merciless night. Silence returned, broken only by the panicked shuffling of cattle and the rasp of his own breath. The acrid tang of gunpowder hung in the air. Clara lowered her weapon with calm precision, eyes sweeping the yard as though ensuring no threat remained. Her chest rose and fell, steady, unshaken. Elias stared at her, chest heaving, sweat slick on his skin. He had fought before, bled before, but never had he witnessed a woman stand as she had, unyielding, resolute, fearless. "Are you hurt?" she asked, voice even. "No," he managed, though the word caught in his throat. She gave a single nod and turned to calm the nearest cow, running a hand down its trembling flank. The gesture was so ordinary after such violence that Elias felt the ground tilt beneath him. He watched her in silence, realization settling like a stone in his chest. She had not only saved his ranch, she had saved him. For the first time in years, he felt something other than grief or anger, something sharp and alive, a stirring he could neither name nor deny. Morning brought no peace. As the sun bled over the horizon, a rider appeared with dust trailing behind him. He bore a letter, folded and sealed, addressed not to Elias but to Clara. She accepted it with a flicker of unease in her eyes, though her face quickly hardened. Elias watched as she broke the seal, her fingers pausing halfway through the lines. The paper trembled slightly in her grip before she folded it shut. "Who's it from?" he asked, suspicion prickling. Her gaze lifted to meet his, steady but shadowed. "Someone who knows me better than I told you." The word sliced through the fragile thread of trust that had begun to form. Elias's stomach knotted, his mind spinning with questions he hadn't thought to ask before. He had taken her name and her story at face value, but now he wondered what truth she had buried beneath her unshakable exterior. Clara slipped the letter into her trunk without another word. The silence between them felt heavier than the echo of gunfire, heavier even than the loneliness that had haunted him for years. Elias turned away, staring at the horizon where the Rustlers had vanished hours before. The land stretched vast and indifferent, its silence no longer the familiar companion it once had been. Something had shifted irreversibly. Clara May was not only the woman he had not expected, she was a woman he did not fully know. And the question that burned hotter than the rising sun was whether that truth would bind them together or break them apart. The letter lingered in Elias's mind like a thorn buried deep in flesh. He tried to work through the day as if nothing had changed, mending fences, hauling water, checking the cattle, but every swing of the hammer, every grunt of effort was weighted with suspicion. Clara moved alongside him with her usual efficiency, but a quiet guardedness had settled into her eyes, as though she had drawn up walls against him. The silence between them stretched longer than the plains themselves, heavy with all the words neither dared to speak. At last, when the sun had bled itself dry across the horizon and shadows swallowed the yard, Elias found his voice. "You owe me the truth," he said, his tone rougher than he intended. Clara paused, hand resting on the doorframe, back to him. For a moment he thought she might ignore him altogether. But then she turned, shoulders squared, gaze steady. "The truth is simple," she said. "I came here under my sister's name." The word struck harder than any blow. He stepped closer, jaw tight. "Why?" "Because men don't marry women like me," she answered, no tremor in her voice. "They marry the delicate, the dainty, the ones who need rescuing. My sister fit that mold, so I borrowed it. I knew if I sent my own likeness, my own truth, your letter would have stayed unanswered." Her bluntness carved through the air, raw and unashamed. Elias felt the weight of it press into his chest, heavier even than the rifle he carried through every fight. "So you deceived me." "I survived," she corrected, "and I pulled my share of the weight since stepping off that wagon. You can't deny that." He opened his mouth, closed it again. The images came unbidden, the sight of her firing into the dark, the sound of her laughter cutting through silence, the feel of her presence filling every hollow space of the cabin. She was right. She had not come empty-handed. She had brought strength, fierce and unyielding, a strength that had carried him through battles both seen and unseen. Elias turned away, pacing the length of the porch. The boards creaked under his boots, echoing the storm in his chest. He had clung for years to a vision of what a wife should be, fragile, soft-spoken, an echo of the gentleness he had lost. Clara was none of that. She was something altogether different, and perhaps that was why she unsettled him so deeply. "You should have told me," he said finally, quieter this time. "I was afraid," she admitted, and in those 3 words her armor cracked. The confession was plain, unadorned, yet it carried the weight of her entire past. Afraid of being unwanted, afraid of being cast aside. The vulnerability in her voice echoed his own secret fears, the ones he buried beneath silence and welk. The night air cooled between them, and Elias felt something shift. He had spent years believing he was the only one broken by loss, the only one carrying scars invisible to the eye. But now he saw Clara not as a deception but as a mirror, someone shaped by hardship, someone who had built her strength because weakness had never been permitted. He stepped closer, the fire in his chest softening into something steadier. "I don't need porcelain," he said. "Not in the mall." Her eyes widened, a flicker of surprise breaking through the calm exterior she wore so well. For the first time since her arrival, she looked uncertain, as though she had prepared for every fight but not for kindness. Elias reached for her hand, callous and strong, and held it in his own. The touch was awkward, unfamiliar, but it was real. Days turned into weeks, and the ranch began to change. Where once the fences sagged, they stood firm. Where once the cattle wandered restless, they grazed in steady order. Together, Elias and Clara rebuilt not just the land but themselves. Their work moved in rhythm, his strength tempered by haze, her determination softened by his quiet endurance. The townsfolk who had laughed when she first stepped off the wagon now tipped their hats with respect, whispering about the couple who had tamed both rustlers and loneliness with the same ferocity. One evening they sat side by side on the porch, the sky painted gold and crimson by the setting sun. Elias leaned back, the wood warm beneath him, watching the horizon stretch wide and unbroken. For the first time in years, he felt no urge to stare into it with longing. The ache of solitude that had once gnawed at him was gone, replaced by something steadier, something alive. Clara spoke softly, almost to herself. "Never thought I'd find a place that felt like mine." Elias turned, studying the strong line of her profile, the way the fading light caught in her braid. "It's ours now," he said. She looked at him then, eyes searching, and for once there was no challenge, no guarded edge, only quiet understanding. The night deepened, stars piercing the velvet sky. Elias felt the weight of all that had passed, the loneliness, the anger, the suspicion, settle into the background, leaving only the steady beat of a life remade. Clara had not been the woman he expected, but she had become the woman he needed. Stronger than his grief, louder than his silence, fierce enough to stand beside him when the world threatened to break. And as the prairie stretched endlessly before them, Elias Boone realized he was no longer the loner of Deadwood Plains. He was a man reborn, tethered not by memory but by the living bond beside him. A narrator's voice seemed to rise from the land itself, carrying the lesson like wind across the grass. Love does not always arrive in the shape we imagine. Sometimes it comes larger than life, twice as fierce, and exactly when the heart needs it most. If this story has left its mark on you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments, because every tale, like every frontier, grows stronger when it's shared.